I thought I was alone with her, until her sister quietly climbed into my lap, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The evening settled in with a comforting hush, the kind that only comes when the world outside feels distant. I sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the dim light from the pendant lamp casting a soft glow over her face. She had that quiet elegance about her, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle curve of her lips when she laughed at something I said. There was a warmth in her presence that made the room feel smaller, cozier, like it was just the two of us against the world. We were making dinner together, though not in any rushed or chaotic way. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, reaching for a bowl of vegetables or seasoning a pan with a light touch that barely brushed my fingers. Every small contact, her fingers grazing mine for a moment, the weight of her hand on my shoulder as she leaned to check a simmering pot, felt charged with a quiet intimacy. It wasn't passionate in the dramatic sense, but in these gentle touches, there was a kind of reassurance that grounded me. I noticed the way she hummed softly to herself while stirring, a sound so familiar it felt like part of the furniture in the room, steady and unassuming. The smell of her perfume, warm, slightly floral, comforting, mingled with the earthy aroma of the cooking vegetables. I realized I was memorizing her presence, not in a fleeting, distracted way, but in a slow, deliberate observation. The arch of her neck, the curve of her jaw, the calm steadiness of her eyes as they met mine across the table. We spoke about inconsequential things, the new book she was reading, a funny story from her day at work, but even these small conversations carried weight. Her voice had a resonance that drew me in, and there were pauses, slight hesitations, where she looked at me in a way that made me acutely aware of her attention. In those moments, silence wasn't empty, it was full of meaning, of connection, of trust. I reached across the table and brushed a crumb from her sleeve. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a heartbeat, our fingers lingered close, not quite touching, but enough to make me feel the warmth of her proximity. It was in this quiet domesticity that I realized how natural she felt in my life, like the room itself had shifted to accommodate her presence. I wasn't thinking about the outside world, deadlines, or obligations, only the gentle rhythm of her movements, the subtle glances, the understated ways she showed care. There was a simplicity to it, a rare and fragile comfort, but also a tension I couldn't ignore, the sense that these quiet, perfect moments were fleeting, and that every glance, every touch, carried the weight of unspoken emotion. By the time she excused herself to take a phone call, the room felt emptier in her absence, even though only a few steps separated us. The soft click of the door behind her left a lingering warmth on the chair where she had been sitting, a reminder of the intimacy of shared space. And I realized, with a mix of longing and curiosity, that this evening was just the beginning of something far more complicated than it seemed. Her voice lingered in the kitchen for a moment longer, warm and melodic, as she mentioned she needed to take a call in the living room. I watched her retreat through the doorway, the soft swish of her dress and the subtle scent of her perfume drifting away, leaving an emptiness that immediately felt larger than the space itself. The kitchen, moments ago brimming with quiet energy, now seemed to hold only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the wall clock. I sank slightly into the chair she had vacated, letting my fingers brush against the smooth edge of the table as if tracing her absence could somehow bring her closer. It was strange how quickly a room could feel different with just one person gone, and yet I couldn't shake the warmth she left behind, a warmth that lingered in the faint impressions her presence had made. I noticed the subtle details, the soft indentation of the chair where she had been sitting, the faint aroma of the tea she had poured, the way the light from the window highlighted the curve of her hair that had brushed the chair back. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply exist in that quiet, noticing the small things I usually overlooked. The room was calm, almost suspended in time, and I realized I was aware of every sound, the muted ticking, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the faint whisper of wine through the open window. Each small noise seemed amplified in her absence, and I felt a curious tension build, a kind of anticipation that something subtle, but significant, was about to shift. I caught myself thinking about her, not in a yearning or desperate way, but in a careful, observant way. How the corners of her mouth lifted when she smiled at a joke, how her eyes held a quiet patience when she listened, the rhythm of her movements as she navigated the room with grace. In this moment of temporary solitude, the things I had taken for granted, the brush of her hand, the warmth of her proximity, even her quiet breathing beside me, were suddenly magnified. It was then that I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, a slow, steady thrum that seemed louder in the empty kitchen. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her to return, even though part of me wasn't sure what I was waiting for. The silence was comfortable, yet it was electric in its own way, an unspoken prelude to the unexpected. As I shifted in the chair, my sleeve brushing against the tabletop, I felt the weight of anticipation settle over me like a quiet fog. The room was no longer just a kitchen, it was a space charged with subtle emotion, where the absence of one presence made room for another. And deep down, I sensed that this brief interlude, this moment of quiet and waiting, would soon become the hinge upon which the evening, and perhaps much more, would turn. The door to the living room remained slightly ajar, and I found myself staring at it, the familiar comfort of her absence now tinged with curiosity and a hint of tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft shadow, made me wonder what might happen in these few minutes while she was away. And in that delicate, suspended moment, I had no idea how much the next few minutes would change everything. I had been sitting there, letting the quiet stretch around me like a gentle fog, when I heard the soft click of the front door opening again. At first I assumed it was her returning, my girlfriend, stepping back into the room with her familiar grace. But the figure that appeared in the doorway was taller in a different way, her presence immediately commanding attention without a word. It was her sister, moving with that same quiet confidence I had always admired from afar, her steps deliberate, her posture effortless. There was something in the way she entered the space that made the room feel different, as if her energy subtly reshaped the air around me. She smiled, not a wide, playful grin, but a knowing, calm smile that seemed to acknowledge the tension in the room without needing to speak. Her eyes, warm and attentive, held a hint of mischief that made my chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. She leaned casually against the doorframe for a moment, just observing, and the slight tilt of her head made her hair catch the light, shimmering in a way that drew my attention without me realizing it. I noticed the small, deliberate details about her that made her presence so compelling. The way her fingers lingered on the doorframe as she shifted her weight, the faint scent of her perfume, a warmer, slightly spicier version of my girlfriend's, that seemed to envelop me in a subtle cocoon of familiarity and curiosity. There was a softness in her gaze, an understated vulnerability that peeked through her confident exterior, and it struck me that beneath her composed demeanor, she was just as human, just as complex, as anyone else in the room. She took a slow step forward, letting the gentle hum of the kitchen fill the space between us. Every movement was measured, like a dance I wasn't yet fully aware I was part of. When she settled into the arm of the couch across from me, the distance felt both comforting and electric. Her presence created a new rhythm in the room, one that contrasted with the quiet intimacy I had shared with my girlfriend only moments before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it pulled at the edges of my attention in a way I couldn't ignore. We began talking casually, light remarks about the day, a question about the tea she saw on the counter, but there was an undercurrent beneath the words, a tension that lingered in the pauses, the way our eyes occasionally met and held just slightly too long. I became aware of how much I was noticing, the tilt of her shoulders as she leaned forward, the delicate arch of her eyebrows when she laughed, the warmth radiating from her presence even without physical contact. As the minutes passed, I realized something strange. The room no longer felt empty in my girlfriend's absence. Her sister had shifted the dynamic entirely, introducing an unfamiliar warmth and intrigue that made the quiet space feel alive with possibility. And though I knew boundaries were important, I couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something delicate, unspoken, a subtle tension that neither of us acknowledged aloud but was impossible to ignore. In that suspended moment, the world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of the lamp, and the quiet, magnetic presence of her sister, the space between us electric with a curiosity either of us had yet dared to name. The conversation with her sister had started lightly, casual remarks about trivial things, yet there was an underlying current that neither of us could ignore. I noticed the way she shifted on the couch, a subtle movement closer to me, her knee brushing against mine just enough to make me acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her body. It was a fleeting contact, almost accidental, yet it lingered in my mind long after it happened, sending a strange mixture of curiosity and caution through me. She laughed softly at something I said, and her hand brushed against my arm in a gesture so gentle it could have been mistaken for chance. I felt the quick pulse of connection in that touch, the warmth of her skin, the faint pressure of her fingers as if testing the boundaries of proximity. Her eyes held mine just a fraction longer than normal, and for a brief moment, time seemed suspended. I became hyper-aware of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her clothes as she moved, the subtle rise and fall of her chest with each quiet breath. When I shifted slightly to reach for a mug of tea, she leaned in, almost instinctively, letting her shoulder brush against mine. The movement was casual, almost natural, but I felt the deliberate intention beneath it, as though she were anchoring herself close to me without saying a word. Her warmth pressed against me lightly, not overwhelming, but enough that I felt a subtle tremor of awareness, an acknowledgement of the intimacy that existed in these small, quiet moments. Then, almost without realizing it, she perched on the edge of my lap, not with urgency, but with a careful, deliberate casualness that made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't provocative, it was intimate, an unspoken trust and familiarity that felt simultaneously daring and safe. Her presence so close, the weight of her thighs against mine, the faint warmth of her body radiating through the thin fabric of our clothes, created a new layer of tension I hadn't anticipated. I could feel the slight pressure of her hands resting on my shoulders for balance, the subtle brush of her hair against my neck, and the gentle cadence of her breathing as she settled. We didn't speak immediately. Instead, there was a shared quiet, filled only by the ambient hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock. The silence was charged, not awkward, but meaningful. Every glance, every slight shift of her body, carried weight. I felt her eyes on me, observing, playful, curious, and the warmth of her proximity made my chest tighten with awareness. My hands hovered at my sides, reluctant to move, yet conscious of the subtle electricity between us. In that suspended moment, everything was amplified, the small gestures, the accidental touches, the unspoken tension building in a way that neither of us fully acknowledged. It was as if the room had shrunk to just the two of us, each movement, each breath, magnified. I realized how delicate this connection was, how easily it could tip into something more, yet how thrilling it was simply to exist in this quiet closeness. And in that moment, I understood that the evening had shifted irreversibly, everything familiar now tinged with possibility, anticipation, and unspoken longing. After a few moments of quiet, her presence on my lap shifted from playful to something more subtle, more profound. The air between us felt heavier, charged not with physical desire, but with an unspoken recognition of our shared humanity, our vulnerabilities, our fears, our small confessions that had no audience but each other. She adjusted slightly, leaning back against me, and I felt the gentle weight of her head resting near my shoulder. It wasn't intimate in a romantic sense, not yet, but it was personal in a way that made my chest tighten and my heart beat a little faster. She spoke softly, almost as if testing the air, revealing pieces of herself I hadn't known, the loneliness that crept in on quiet evenings, the moments of self-doubt that no one else saw, the small regrets that had quietly shaped her life. Her voice was steady, but it carried a tenderness that made me acutely aware of the fragility beneath her composed exterior. I listened, wanting to respond but also aware that this was her space, her moment of trust. I reached out instinctively, letting my fingers brush against hers in a casual yet reassuring gesture, and she didn't pull away. The touch was fleeting, but it carried a weight far greater than words ever could. I found myself sharing, too, revealing glimpses of my own hesitations, my own insecurities, the subtle ways I navigated the world, the quiet fears that lingered behind my calm exterior. Our conversation didn't feel like small talk anymore. It was a careful weaving of truths, an unspoken agreement that in this suspended bubble of time, we could exist honestly, without judgment. Every pause, every sigh, every glance carried meaning. Her eyes met mine often, searching and understanding, and I felt the profound effect of being truly seen. The subtle physical closeness amplified the emotional resonance. Her hand shifted lightly on my shoulder, a gentle weight that grounded me. The faint warmth of her body, pressed against mine, radiated in a way that was comforting yet electrifying. When she laughed softly at something I admitted, the sound was more than amusement. It was relief, recognition, a connection that transcended the ordinary. I could feel her exhale against my arm, and it became a rhythm, a silent communication that spoke louder than any words. In those moments, I realized that our closeness was not just physical but emotional. The lap she perched on was more than a seat. It was a space where trust, understanding, and subtle intimacy converged. Every shift, every lean, every fleeting brush of fingers was an affirmation of the bond forming between us, a bond built on honesty, patience, and shared human fragility. By the time she looked up at me with that faint, knowing smile, I knew this was no longer simply a casual moment between friends or acquaintances. It was a pause in the world, a delicate acknowledgement of connection that neither of us had expected but both of us recognized. And in that quiet, suspended space, I understood the power of vulnerability, the way it could transform proximity into a deep, unspoken intimacy, and leave me acutely aware of the fragile, beautiful tension simmering just beneath the surface. We were wrapped in that quiet, suspended bubble, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the distant ticking of the clock serving as the only backdrop to our shared stillness, when the sound of the front door opening caught my attention. My chest tightened instantly. She was back. My girlfriend. The familiar rhythm of her presence was about to fill the room, and with it, the delicate tension that had been building would meet the reality of her gaze. Her sister shifted slightly on my lap, just enough that I could feel the subtle warmth of her movement, and our eyes met in silent acknowledgement. Neither of us spoke, we didn't need to. The brief pause stretched like elastic, full of unspoken understanding. We had crossed a line into intimacy of a kind neither of us could have anticipated. My heart raced, a low, steady thrum echoing in my chest, and I became acutely aware of the weight of her sister's hand on my shoulder, the gentle press of her body against mine. Every micro-movement was magnified in this suspended moment. Then she appeared. My girlfriend stepped back into the room, her eyes immediately assessing, taking in the scene without judgment but with quiet curiosity. The soft click of the door behind her seemed to mark the shift from private intimacy to the larger reality of our triangle. There was a beat of hesitation, mine, hers, and her sister's, where the room held its collective breath. It was electric, a charged silence that balanced delicately between tension and understanding. I felt a sudden surge of awareness, the delicate way her sister had leaned into me, the warmth of her proximity, the subtle traces of connection we had shared in those few minutes. And yet, there was no shame, only the recognition of human closeness, the complexity of emotional bonds that weren't easily categorized. I exhaled slowly, deliberately, letting the tension ease, while her sister mirrored the gesture, leaning back just enough to respect the boundaries that now felt essential. The conversation that followed was quiet, gentle, and surprisingly honest. Words were measured, but meaningful. We acknowledged the unusual tension without dramatizing it. No accusations, no anger, just quiet honesty. There were shared smiles, slight nods, subtle gestures that conveyed both understanding and restraint. Her sister's hand lingered briefly near mine, then withdrew, a conscious acknowledgement of the closeness we had shared and the lines we would respect. What struck me most was the sense of humanity in that moment, the recognition that affection, curiosity, and intimacy can exist in ways that are complex and layered, without crossing into harm or disrespect. We all navigated the moment with care, glances held and released, small touches that were fleeting and respectful, voices soft and calm. The warmth in the room shifted from private, charged tension to a shared, comfortable understanding. By the time my girlfriend settled into the space, smiling gently, the awkwardness had transformed into a quiet acknowledgement of connection. It was a subtle, human balance, the realization that relationships can be layered and intricate, and that respect and care can coexist with curiosity and emotional closeness. The moment passed, leaving only warmth, shared understanding, and the knowledge that the evening had changed irrevocably, but not in a way that diminished the bonds between any of us. The tension that had seemed almost unbearable just moments ago gradually softened as the three of us settled into the room. There were no rushed gestures, no dramatic declarations, only the quiet rhythm of breathing, laughter, and the gentle shift of bodies in familiar spaces. My girlfriend's return had reminded me of the grounding force of her presence, yet her sister's closeness lingered in my mind, a subtle reminder of the delicate intimacy we had shared. The evening now felt like a living balance, a complex, layered connection that demanded patience, respect, and understanding. We talked for a while, voices low and calm, sharing anecdotes about our day, observations about the little details in the apartment, and gentle teasing about the minor chaos of our evening. Her sister rested nearby on the couch, occasionally leaning into my shoulder in a casual, non-intrusive way, and I felt the warmth of her presence without guilt or tension. My girlfriend noticed these small gestures, not with judgment, but with a quiet acceptance that surprised me. Her eyes held both amusement and a deep, patient understanding, as if she recognized that emotional closeness can take many forms, and that it doesn't always diminish the love she and I shared. There was a subtle moment of synchronicity, when all three of us laughed at something trivial, and it struck me how rare and delicate that kind of harmony could be. Her sister's hand brushed mine lightly as she reached for her tea, a fleeting touch, yet it felt grounded in trust rather than temptation. My girlfriend shifted slightly to include both of us in the same space, closing the small physical distance with a casual grace that seemed to dissolve any lingering awkwardness. The room felt warmer, fuller, and strangely serene, the quiet acknowledgement that emotional bonds can coexist, even when layered with complexity. I realized that what had begun as a moment of tension had transformed into something far more human, a shared understanding of vulnerability, trust, and connection. The way her sister leaned slightly against me, the way my girlfriend rested her hand lightly on mine, the quiet smiles and lingering glances, all these small gestures created a tapestry of warmth that transcended any simple definition of relationship. We were not bound by conventional expectations in that moment. Instead, we were bound by a careful, respectful closeness that allowed each of us to feel seen, valued, and included. Eventually, the room grew quieter, the hum of the refrigerator and the fading light from the window filling the space with a soft, comforting glow. Her sister shifted back on the couch, leaning in a casual, comfortable way that still allowed room for me to breathe, while my girlfriend rested her head lightly on my shoulder for a fleeting second, a small, affectionate gesture that spoke volumes. I felt the combined warmth of their presence, a quiet human intimacy that was comforting, grounding, and unexpectedly profound. As the evening drew to a close, I realized that this night had changed everything without breaking anything. We had navigated boundaries, curiosity, and affection with care, and in doing so, discovered a rare and delicate equilibrium. The room was filled with quiet warmth, shared smiles, and the kind of gentle closeness that lingers long after a moment has passed. And in that moment, I understood that love, trust, and connection can take many forms, and that sometimes, the most profound intimacy is not about possession